Aim in the work. The idea of help in this work is difficult to understand, as at certain moments we are all helped by life, when things go well for us. P.D. Ouspensky would say that life is too easy for us all. He possibly meant that we fail to understand what help in the work sense really means, because when life is difficult, we often feel in some way offended or depressed. When the help of life is withdrawn from us, we feel upset that things are not going according to our form of expectancy of life, of how we believe life ought to be going according to our imagination of it. In that case, we simply become a function of life and of its external circumstances, which is one meaning of the work phrase, "We are mechanisms driven by life." The work, however, is not only about this mechanical relation to life. It is not about any mechanical stability or balance that we acquire from our lives, but a new balance that can only be created through work on ourselves. This idea of work is difficult to grasp for some time, and then none of us probably grasps it deeply enough. Do you have something in you that can resist the ups and downs of life, or are you simply a creature of external circumstance, chance, and happenstance? It is fairly evident that the work is teaching us a new way of balancing ourselves. When, for example, it says, we must not identify as much as we do, meaning that we must not take life as it presents itself to us, by its ever-changing events. Suppose we identify a great deal when things are good, and when things are bad. For example, growing excited when things go well, and then plunging into despair when things turn bad. Then we are simply a function of life, a cog of nature's wheel in the work sense. We are bobbing about upon the waves as corks cast into the sea, thinking we are control centers, rising up and down with each wave, having no boat to sail or direct in the direction that we wish to go, in spite of the weather. Let's say that external events do not please us particularly, and we begin to object to this or that. Then let's say that it occurs to us that this is an occasion when we might work on ourselves, perhaps not express negative emotions, and be more careful to not react so mechanically, in the light of all that we have been taught in this work. Here a new set of ideas comes into play, the ideas taught through work on self. In that case, we can begin to apply work ideas to ourselves, and to some small extent cease to be such a machine, a mechanism driven by life and its external, ever-changing events. Suppose that we do this once, then it becomes easier for us to do it a second time, when more or less similar circumstances arise. This is tasting the work and its quality. If we never taste the work in this way, nor its quality, then expect that because we hear of or read work commentaries, then everything is going to be better for us. Henceforth, we have a very naive idea of what this work means, by thinking that knowledge of the work is going to make everything somehow easier, a very superficial concept of esotericism and its teaching. The object of esoteric teaching is to produce a profound change in the person one is, a profound change in our level of being, thereby changing the course of our fate. There are many things in this work we cannot understand with our head, and only with the heart, or by feeling them deeply. It takes two centers to understand anything more fully. We may work very hard on the formatory side of this work, trying to work out each idea endlessly in Aristotelian logic. While this is not entirely wasted, it is absolutely necessary to have a practical feeling about what the ideas mean too, an emotional perception of the truth of this work. We may talk and write a long time about what identifying means, without any emotional perception of its meaning. Or we may have many thoughts about what lying means, yet never emotionally perceive what that means. This is because we have not applied the perception to ourselves, not seen lying or insincerity within us, and whether these are an absolute fact of life. We can turn now to the question of aim in this work. We can never formulate an aim unless we first see what the work is about ourselves, and our relationship to higher centers or real conscience. All aim in this work must be connected with that effort, with working on yourself primarily, working with others, and with the whole meaning of esotericism, i.e. with the work itself, which all starts with the first line of work with regard to aim. Where do you think you should work on yourself in connection with the ideas of this work? Have you woven some fairly clear concept of your life, and what you should try to change on that path, in view of what you have been taught. Unless you start there at that place, you will never have an aim of practical use with regard to yourself. What is it you think you ought to change in the self? This question becomes interesting because we may, from acquired conscience, from buffers, from pretenses, from false personality and our culture, have an idea that we should change something or other. The point being, if we are guided by our acquired ideas and opinions, then we are following the wrong mentor and must start from what the work teaches, because the work replaces real conscience for us for the time being, such as we find ourselves. It teaches what real conscience would be able to teach us, if it were awakened within, by having our own ideas of what we ought to do, or be like, and what we ought to be aiming at. We are bound to go wrong at first from the point of view of this work, because we are acting from an ordinary knowledge, and not from work knowledge. We interfere with the action of the work upon us, submitting ourselves to all sorts of useless privations and endeavors, in an attempt to focus will. Real knowledge, however, is quite different from what we call acquired knowledge. Esoteric knowledge is a special understanding that we have to gather along the way, then gradually feel through an emotional development which gives us a personal experience of its meaning. All this has to do with what kind of effort is required to change our being. Any ordinary ideas or ordinary knowledge will not change our being, and probably only increase fixation with our present state of being. If we think that we know already, then we will not take knowledge of this work seriously. If we are quite sure that we know what is right and wrong, then we will not be able to change. A person must awaken eventually to the authority of the work, and begin to view themselves in the light of what it says. We may think, for example, that many of our negative emotions are correct, and so not call them negative emotions. Yet the work teaches that all negative emotions are wrong, no matter what that cause or justification might be. The work does not look at the causes of negative emotions but at the fact that we are negative. P.D. Ouspensky asked, why we always explain our negative emotions by the causes that gave rise to them, the whole point being that we are negative, and that is what we have to work upon. We all know how negative emotions prevent development, making it impossible for our emotional center to communicate with higher centers. If we could communicate with higher emotional center, our lives would be utterly different, and we would find an entirely new set of rules whereby to live, all far more subtle than those we follow in ordinary everyday life. We would find, for example, that where we always take a situation in one way, there are 100 or even 1,000 ways, all quite different, that there is no stereotypical way of taking the events of life. This is one of the greatest things to understand with regard to aim in connection with how we behave. We behave in a rigid, stereotypical way, and so tend to make rigid, stereotyped aims. There is a certain light-heartedness in realizing that we need not take things always in quite the same manner. However, before we reach this beginning of inner freedom, we must realize that life is events, then notice how we react mechanically to each of the different events of our lives. Looking out through limited senses, we see life as a number of objects, and fail to see it as changing events. This is probably one of the first difficulties we have in understanding what this work is about. We fail to see events because they can only be mentally and emotionally realized. For example, we can see a table, a chair, a tree, and a person. These objects are not events necessarily, but supposing the tree falls on the table and kills the person sitting at it, smashing the chair. That is an event. All these physical objects which are not events, suddenly become related through an event, and all it took was a gust of wind. A person is not an event but simply an object. However, suppose that you hate this person when you see them, this makes an event. Events gather together objects into a certain relationship. A table by itself is not an event, but if breakfast is laid upon it, it participates in an event for you, and if the egg is not boiled properly, then it becomes a negative event. A tornado that suddenly lifts off the roofs of houses is an event, but if you stare at the roof, it is not an event. A thing that you have in your possession to look at sometimes, such as a gold watch, is not an event but an object. However, if it is stolen, it becomes an event. You get up in the morning and stub your toe on the carpet, then the carpet becomes an event. In other words, an event is something that relates a number of objects together in a certain way. This is a very inadequate description of events, however, we must try to see what is meant. It is towards these events that we must try to acquire conscious behavior. In other words, we have to see our lives as a series of events and not objects, because it is very easy to stare at everything like horses and trees, failing to understand that unless they are related to you in some way, they do not constitute an event. This is getting off the purely sensual level, noticing that objects are not events in and of themselves. In making this connection with the first line of work, we can observe events to which we react in a particular way, because it is in our reactions to life as events that our personal work lies for a long time. The way we take events happening in a world of external objects. We find it difficult to believe in events as distinct from objects. For example, we find it difficult to believe that we ourselves may be in the next moment consumed by violent temper because of some event in which we are included. We do not see that an event has occurred, a triad of forces have suddenly arisen and then acted upon us, and we have been caught up in them, as by a whirlwind, in which different eyes all have charge of us for as long as the event lasts. After the event has passed, we wonder what happened because all the objects around us are just as before, but while the event lasted they conducted different forces, within which we were included. When we make an aim, we always neglect events. We do not take into consideration how difficult it will be to keep that aim in view of different events that may arise for us. We expect a tranquil sea upon which to steer a direct course, therefore when our aim is rather superficial and momentary, formed in a bout of enthusiasm, we find it is absolutely useless and leads nowhere. However, instead of becoming offended and beginning to blame the work, we should understand what it means to be sly man, or as the Gospels call it, phronimos, wise men, in which wise really means clever. Recall that the wise virgins were not wise but clever, and that this word in the Gospels meaning clever or mentally awake is the same as the word sly used in this work. A superficial aim will lead nowhere, particularly if it is from a quiet conscience which has behind it only merit or vanity. These aims turned towards external life are of no use in any work on self, as they do not touch the esoteric level, a level of real conscience. To begin to have a real aim, we must already know that we cannot keep it, and as it were, not tell ourselves what this real aim is. Real aim comes from something far deeper in us, something emotional. In Matthew it is said, "Let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth." Chapter 6 verse 3. In the language of parables, left is the weak side, i.e. personality, and right means a deeper and more real side of us, which we could call the self. So if we make an aim with our left hand, and tell ourselves that we will get some advantage from it, some sort of merit and praise or recognition from other people, that we will be better thought of, even in the work, then we will not be doing it from our right hand, or our real side. For this reason, real aim must always be something we can never quite put into words, and so letting our false personality know about it, then we must not expect to attain its objective right away. We will have in fact probably to follow a devious and apparently contradictory path to fulfill real aim. Then above all we must not think that because things go wrong our aim is useless. The most important thing to understand is that in real aim we cannot go directly towards it, but like a sailing ship at sea which endeavors to sail to a certain goal, we must tack one way, and then another way, according to the wind and currents. A real aim depends upon an emotional perception of something we dislike in ourselves, and that we wish to change eventually. It depends upon a certain integrity of feeling that persists in spite of downfalls. Thus, great patience is necessary with regard to any real aim. A formatory aim is quite different from real aim, and although we begin with formatory aims at first, we must realize they cannot be kept, and so must admit that we cannot really do anything, at least not in the sense that we imagine. Real aim can only arise through long observation and real evaluation of this work. Because unless the presence of the work is constantly with real aim, unless we rely on the work as well as ourselves to keep it, it can lead nowhere except into false personality and a feeling of merit. Real aim always nourishes us. Nourishes our understanding, and then we realize how it can change and yet remain all the while the same. How it can tack from one side to another and never go in the direct course which our natural impatience demands. Because all real aim is connected with our own self-development, with the development of essence in us. With the development of understanding, which is the greatest force we can create. Whereas false aim cannot develop our understanding and very often simply contracts us, turning us into Puritans and fundamentalists, into the rigid dogmatism of some trivial internal decision. We can do nothing by suddenly cutting ourselves off from what we have been, through some arbitrary act, and it is only by modification and transformation that we can change our lives. When we have real aim, we see the difficulties of keeping it. When we make some minor formatory aim, it is quite different. We are told to make aims with the object of seeing that we cannot keep them, so that we can see second force or the force of resistance. However, when we come to make real aim, we are more aware of second force, and the difficulties that will stand in the way of our maintaining this aim. Real aim is a silent aim, something we never tell anyone else or even tell ourselves in so many words. And this kind of aim is of such a quality that we are not dismayed by the constant apparent breaking of it, or the contradictions that arise in connection with it, when apparently we are going in a different direction from what was intended. The illustration of a sailing ship setting out to cross the Atlantic from east to west is a good analogy. That ship cannot ever really go directly to the west, but must go northwest, southwest, and even occasionally in the reverse direction for the time being. Yet at the same time, if it keeps to its aim, it will eventually get to where it intended. It does not lose hope, it does not despair, because there is a certain deep intention of getting eventually where it must go. That is Vahan, as described in Vedic texts.